have four speakers that are joining us this evening. Professor Paul Jepson, Director of the Integrated Plant Protection Center at Oregon State University.
Good evening.
Yes. Lisa Arkin is the Executive Director of the Oregon Toxics Alliance, a nonprofit organization based in Eugene, Oregon. We have Josh Lambert, who some of you may have had the pleasure of meeting already. He's the Invasive Species Program Manager for the Lincoln Soil and Water Conservation District. So he is an asset working with us locally in this county. And Wally Orchard, who is the chair of the Yachats Invasive Plant Subcommittee. The first panelist to present to you today will be Professor Jepson. Paul Jepson completed his Bachelor of Science in Zoology and Applied Entomology at Imperial College London and a PhD in Applied Insect Ecology from Cambridge University before taking up a lectureship in invasive plant management and exotoxicology at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom, where he also coordinated an international Master of Science program on invasive plant management. He came to Oregon State University in 1995 and has been the director of the Integrated Plant Protection Center within the College of Agricultural Sciences, and he is the state's invasive plant coordinator and professor in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology since July of 2002. So it is with pleasure that I will turn the stage over to Dr. Jepson.
Well, thank you very much for the lovely welcome. We've had a delightful afternoon here looking around some of your invasive plants, which you might think is a slightly strange thing to do on a Saturday afternoon, but we had a lot of fun. And I'm the Integrated Pest Management Coordinator, so I deal with pest diseases and weeds, just to clarify that a little bit. We work in many different countries in our operation, 8 different countries at the moment, 6 of which are in West Africa actually, which is a rather long way away. And we work with partners throughout the state of Oregon, mainly in agriculture, and I'll touch on the programs we have a little bit at the end. But my purpose today was to clarify what the challenge is about invasive plants, to encourage you to participate. I mean, normally you would be called an audience, but officially, as of now, you are called a work crew. Volunteers are just fantastic. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, the car park coming, wasn't it, Wally? Yeah. And this is also, it's a rather marvellous thing. We've been seeing some great community activities, haven't we, today, Lisa and Josh? And the pathways that are being created and the community efforts to establish new ways of managing these plants. And it's really a community effort is going to have end up with a good result here. Everyone has a say in these things. Everyone's priorities ought to be addressed and considered and understood. And there's all sorts of options out there. So I'm going to try and clarify some of that if I possibly can. So could I ask to start with, was anybody here born in Yachats? That's interesting, so you're all invaders. So there goes my opening anecdote, okay? So has anyone lived in Yachats more than 10 years? A few of you, okay. So the rest of you will call the invaders and you're the natives, okay? So a lot of you are sharing, you're next door to the seats next to you is occupied by someone let's assume, an invader. And let's imagine you wanted to stop them turning up here in the first place. I mean, tonight, we could have closed the doors selectively, couldn't we? But if you imagine these plants are coming up and down Highway 101, they're coming in on animal fur, they're travelling down the rivers. There's a constant rain and flow of plants through your community. And this has been happening for a rather long time. But why are invasive plants so much in the news now? What's different? What's changed? We're more mobile than we've ever been before. We've created these roadways and we manage them. We manage the roadside verges in ways that encourage invasive plants. And we create kind of disturbed sites in our own communities that provide habitats for these things to occupy. So my weak analogy to start with, because we didn't have any long-standing, I was born here, my grandfather was raised here, kind of things, that it's, you get my drift. But I mean, even for ourselves, to kind of selectively manage the natives and the non-natives would be rather impossible. And so let's respect the fact that this is a huge challenge today. At the end of my anecdote, by the way, was going to be, there's 4 or 5 gentlemen around the back of the room. I don't know why it's all gentlemen here, but I was going to ask which one of them were born in Yachats. Clearly none of them. So they're obviously a group of alien invaders looking to occupy these seats as soon as you stand up. And that's one of the other issues. You go and cultivate these alien plants and get rid of them. You've created a perfect seedbed and a habitat for those things to come back in. So thinking about how to manage them, it's not that easy. It's a collaborative effort, and we have to do lots of different things together, okay? So that's all I have to say. But, so what is it? What's so bad about these things? We could just leave them alone, and some people now are increasingly saying perhaps we should leave them be. But we're in a rather precious part of the world, aren't we? I mean, if you weren't born here, you decided to come here for some reason, probably work, possibly also the fact this is a kind of jewel of the Oregon coast in some way. And I'm not only saying that because the mayor's in the back of the room, but he did ask me to mention it, of course. But it's a lovely place, and the plants appreciate it too. So what do we like about it? It's kind of ecologically connected, isn't it? Those forests have been there a very long time. Those streams and rivers kind of have salmon runs in them that are very historic in evolutionary time. They've been establishing and evolving and changing for millennia. And so if we value that, it does represent an ecosystem somehow you could describe as healthy. It's got some integrity to it. And that's not really very normal. Where I come from in Europe nowadays, everything's been managed almost to the extent that we can't imagine what the habitats that were originally there were even like. Some of you may have experienced that yourselves. So what do invasive weeds do? I need to check I don't know whether you can see all this, but hopefully in my explanation you can follow what I'm saying. I've also got 30 copies of most of the words on my slides in the front here for any of you that want to grab a copy of that when you leave. So the reduced biodiversity, and biodiversity is one of the measures of the intrinsic value and integrity of an ecological system. It's how many different kinds of things grow and are connected and kind of operate together collaboratively, one could say. So these plants come in and they interfere with biodiversity, and that really isn't a good thing. They change the types of species that are there, the community structure, how many different things are there, and ecological function. I ran a class called Applied Stream Ecology at OSU for 6 years, where I discovered along with the students things like the fact that certain plants, deciduous trees, the leaves fall into the stream in the fall and they get broken up into little bits and scraps, and then the insects eat those, and the insects are consumed by the salmon, and the little bits of leaf that the insects then produce are eaten by other things, and that whole connected ecology is rather extraordinary. So if a plant comes along that's not palatable to those fish or those insects, and it occupies the zone where those plants that do enable salmon to survive so well in our streams were, I mean, you can see, can't you, immediately that's not a good thing. The more subtle things, though, are what if those plants produce flowers and nectar, but no pollinator in its right mind that grew up in Oregon wants to go and take that nectar? Or the pollen's toxic, or it's not really suitable for our native bees. And so subtle things happen that we don't really appreciate until we notice that native flowers that depended on those pollinators are somehow in decline. Also, these plants can form things we call monocultures, these huge mats of vegetation that really don't represent the quality of the system that was there before. So they alter the food and shelter for wildlife. And they can promote wildfires. We saw a beautiful hillside covered in lovely Scotch broom today, but that Scotch broom is really not meant to be there. When it dries out in the summer, it's a potential fire risk. So there's all sorts of things that can happen that make invasive weeds a concern that really the community, the city, the state, the federal system has an interest in. It's a serious matter, this. You can't decide to have a backyard of beautiful invasive plants and expect your neighbours and the county and other people to think you're doing a good thing, and you probably have a knock on the door. So, these are plants that we don't appreciate. Control methods. I use the phrase control, often it's management we're talking about. A lot of plants produce seed and the seed live in the seed bed for 10 years, for 20 years, for 50 years. So we've got a bank, it's called, of seeds that are there. You come along feeling a little bit energetic on a Saturday morning, pull that plant out of the ground, well, 3,000 potential juvenile plants are still in the soil. That one plant you pulled up, well done. But you haven't really managed that plant in that place. So thinking about what one needs to do in the long term is important. So the purpose, controlling or eliminating weeds, great. Enhancing the processes that prevent invasion and re-invasion, fantastic. Let's put barricades up on Highway 101, you know. I mean, that's not really going to happen, is it? So managing your hats so that in the future it doesn't have the susceptibilities that it has at the moment is really the way to think about this. Is this making sense, by the way? Okay. It's unusual for me. So we're preventing continued reproduction and spread. You may have some hotspots of plants and plants that are in a place where you can't afford to manage them, but if they're just there and you can somehow tolerate that, that's okay. You don't want them spreading. So some of the practices we've used of damaging the plants with tillage practices and cutting bars and having tractors drive along the road, spreading bits of the plant along as they go. I mean, that's really not a good thing to do. And the selection of the method one uses, everyone gets really uptight about the methods, for some good reasons, I think, as well. But really, it's the management one needs to consider and the purpose behind that management and what your ultimate goals are. So you may start small, you may do some things that don't seem very efficient, but over time you're going to see those species going down. And so don't get locked into this idea that one golden bullet is going to solve the problem and that's what we need to do. That's just not the case in this type of management. By the same token, I must tell you that having all those different tools and methods available to you is a very good thing, because it allows you then to set priorities. And so that's a thing for your community to talk about also. And selection of the methods depends on what type of plants you've got. We've seen so many plants today, I've actually forgotten how many we saw, Wally. At least 5 or 6 places with different plants of different types in them. Location, access, the climate in a particular place, whether or not there's wildlife around, the resources you've got available, how much funding, and chemical use restrictions or elimination, or however you're going to deal with that. So the criteria for selecting methods, what time am I aiming for, by the way? 10:30? I think about 7:30, 7:35. Is that okay?
7:35.
Yeah, good, thank you. So, you know, you'll be thinking as a group over time about the costs of doing this over about a 10-year period. That's a reasonable time span for this. Don't expect this all to be solved next year. It's not going to happen. But you're contributing to that long-term suppression that you'll all value in the future. How often you need to go back and do what you just did and got that sore back from doing it? You know, the time for restoration to take place. Do you need to actively help that habitat to look as it was before? If you just leave it as it was, as a kind of nice pile of soil that doesn't have invasive plants in it, what's the first plant that's going to find its way back into that place? The invaders. Why? Because their seeds survive better. Because they are built around the whole concept of moving long distances and finding places that other plants haven't got to. So you create an opportunity for those plants, they're going to find it first. And there's a whole range of other things like ecological health risks associated with practices and the ability to limit spread and fire management that we can talk about. So what I'm going to do now is go through a few tactics examples of this I've taken from reviews that have been conducted by other watersheds up and down the coast, mainly in California, some in Oregon. Many other communities are dealing with this. And Yachats, of course. Did I pronounce that correctly?
No.
There you go. Yachats. Well, my revenge is I'll invite you to have a tour of England and I shall check your pronunciation. We're going to start with Gloucester and Norwich. Yachats. Is that good?
Yachats.
Yachats. Yachats. So what I'm showing you is a kind of is a perspective on the way to consider this issue. It's not a solution. I don't make recommendations deliberately. What I do is I facilitate groups and communities to come together to develop their own decisions. And that's a very important distinction, because you'll have ownership of this eventually. So the last thing you want is someone coming in from 6.5 miles away telling you this is what you should do. I probably wouldn't know anyway, you know, so there's lots of opportunities there. So I'm going to talk about several methods now, just to give you an idea about the way in which we evaluate different approaches, because no one approach is great or perfect. No one approach is suited to every single plant. So the first one I was going to talk about was fire, because you know, perhaps what Wally needs is someone in the community that likes playing with matches, you know, but probably not. But fire is one of the methods that has been used where there are very large areas of invasive plants. It's obviously not a chemical method, but fire generates a huge amount of chemistry, so I'm not quite sure why it doesn't fall into the class of chemical methods, to be honest with you. And you can use torches and all sorts of approaches nowadays that you can walk around with, things you can push on trolleys, and you can create huge fiery messes. They can be about 80% effective against adult plants. That's really good. But if you've got uneven rocky areas, you can leave little patches of plants that are there absolutely ready to re-invade that nutrient-rich soil that you've created when the fire went through. So it's just that always there are limitations to these approaches. And also, many species in Oregon evolved in a fiery climate. And so with perennial grasses, you know, you kill off the top of the grass, but the rhizome, the roots survive below the soil and they regrow. You know, else every time there was a forest fire in Oregon, we'd just see black soil for years afterwards. We don't see that, do we? It's green the next spring. So you can promote some species by some of the things you do. And almost every tactic I'm talking about, I could have given a talk about which species are promoted by the different methods I'm discussing, okay? So burning, you know, you can kill some things in the seed bank, but not a lot. The timing is critical. It's very smoky. You can burn things that you didn't intend to burn, which doesn't sound great to me. And it's non-selective, is it? The fire doesn't decide, native species, I'm not going to burn that, I'm going to go for the invader. And so the spectrum of activity is important, and this is as broad spectrum as anything. Fire's more broad spectrum than any herbicide that was ever invented. Mechanical methods. This is machinery, big equipment, the type that things that some of the men here probably are salivating about. Saturday morning spent in the yard, greasing and preparing a beautifully painted piece of equipment to go out there and wreak havoc. Cutting and mowing, kind of a ½ acre plus, you can send machinery into an area and do a lot of damage and kill 50% of adult plants, but you leave the seeds in the soil. And you can scrape and pull with heavy equipment, and for reed canary grass, one of your kind of plants you've got here, that kind of scraping the surface approach is actually rather good, and it's something that's adopted and applied in this area. And historically, that's seen as something that can deal with about more than 50% of adult plants and more than 50% of seeds, but you've always got to be aware that if you remove the soil and the vegetation that's growing out of it, it's not really very selective, is it? It takes the native stuff along with the non-native stuff. So planning what you're going to do afterwards is as important. Plan for the aftermath. We've never heard that before. So non-target vegetation impacts occur, and it opens up the soil for plant invasion. You've got this lovely disturbed area, and what's going to turn up there? Docks and nettles and some of the other things you don't fancy. The side effects include people getting a lot of backache and strains and cuts. Petroleum spills are a concern because petrochemicals hang around in the environment a long time, and in our precious habitats, they're not great things to have about. The birds don't like it, it's noisy, and we get wildlife mortality. And I need to move on a little bit. Hand operation. You know, you are a community of people here with land holdings and properties, and you walk along the riverbank and you see plants you don't like, and you go out with a spade, sometimes you dig them up. And you can use saws and scythes and spades, and you can cut the roots and peel the bark and all sorts of other things. In general, this is considered okay, but it's large adult plants, big woody perennials, you're not going to be too successful with. There's these huge bits of equipment here that you can see that are available via the city council or something, and they can be used to pull up broom plants. And we saw a magnificent pile of plants that had been removed along Highway 101, which is great to see. And here, skill and persistence is critical. An unexpert group going out pulling plants, that's really what you don't want. That's like a non-selective herbicide going out into the forest, I left that plant there, that really tall one, because I thought it was so beautiful. Look, that's the one we were trying to pull up. So you have to be careful about the training and the persistence, and not think, oh, I went out one Sunday in March, that's all I need to do. If you're going to do that, you need to turn up every Sunday, possibly for a couple of years, or contribute to that kind of team mentality and approach. So mowing can damage non-target vegetation. It was applied naively in some municipalities in America in the last 10, 15 years, thinking we don't want herbicides any longer, so let's use a mow. Oh, and 3 years later, why don't we see any flowering plants any longer? And that's because a lot of the flowering plants are producing seed heads, and they're biennial plants. At the time the mowing happens, you kill the plant just before the seed is matured, and those lovely native perennial plants don't survive any longer. You use a selective herbicide, perhaps, to kill a non-native invasive grass. You leave the broadleaf plants there, and they survive. So there's trade-offs here to consider very seriously. I'm not advocating anything. I'm saying understand the impacts of what you might propose. Cultural practices, really great. Again, they can be rather expensive, but you want to put in plants that outcompete those invasive plants. But the invaders are the super competitors of the plant world. So you've got a task on your hand. You need to help them. So solarization, mulching, putting organic matter on top of the plants you want to discourage. You can have some impacts. This doesn't work really well where the plants are adult and established, but for seedlings and for invasive seeds, if you destroy the opportunities for those seeds to emerge and thrive because the other plants you put in there compete for the nutrients, the sunlight and the water, that's what you're really doing. They're eating the dinner beforehand. I mean, if we put on pizza tonight and told the Yachats natives that they were 10 minutes to turn on 10 minutes early, that would have been gone before the non-natives arrived. That's my analogy there. Bit of a weak one, I thought I'd try it out on you there. So that's low impact and it's well planned. So management, I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail, but you need to remove the major culprits first, and then deal with the resprout and the re-emergence. Methods that leave a seed bed or open habitat can basically invite the plants to come back, and it looks worse the second year than it was when you started to manage this in the first place. So we combine methods, cutting, burning and mowing, pulling, piling and flaming, all sorts of approaches. So we need to, every different weed needs to have that approach taken towards it. Choose a method, set of methods, combine them together, but don't leave an opportunity for new invaders to come along. Don't just substitute one invasive plant for another, basically. So if invasion was a product of disturbance and cultivation, don't reproduce those conditions in your control practices. I mean, it sounds obvious, but when you're out there with a spade, feeling like you're doing good and digging for victory and helping the community, it's a shame to tap someone on the shoulder and say, well, actually, you're going to make things worse by doing that. So being judicious and careful and listening to Wally and joining his group and discuss the approaches, that's really great. The costs depend on a lot of things, the labour, the expertise of the workers, how wet it is and steep and difficult, and the prior management history. I was going to tell you a little bit about cost. First of all, I'm going to move on from those, I'm afraid, just to point out that monitoring is critical, which I hadn't really mentioned beforehand, but do you really know where your invasive weeds are? If you think about your yard and the surroundings and the road that leads to your house at the moment, do you know which of those? Can you picture where the invasive plants are? Is there a map? Do you have a map this year that reflects a change because you did some management last year? In 10 years' time, can you look at a map that shows how things have gone from today or last year onwards and you've seen the decline? To reinforce the value of what you're doing, monitoring and mapping is terribly important. Where are the hot spots? Where should my priorities be? That's desperately important. What blend of methods should I use in different places? And if something's going wrong, you need to know early, not 2 years after something reinvaded and made a horrible mess. And that's the history of this practice, really, that you do something and you don't go back and check if you actually did any good. So you're a community here, you live all the time, here all the time, you value the neighbourhood you live in, and so that shouldn't be a problem. But having a map, you can come to a meeting and put a sticker on there if you've seen where an invasive plant is. I think that could be rather good approach. I'm going to say a little bit about herbicides in the last couple of minutes here, just because they are one of the tools in the toolbox. I understand very few herbicides are used here, that's fine. And I just wanted to make the point they are available for use. And there's so many different types. I'm not going to really go into detail, but there's chemicals that you apply to the soil that stop plants emerging. And there's chemicals that you apply after they've emerged. Some of them are systemic and travel round down to the root zone or up into the seed, so you kill all those parts of the plant that you can't necessarily see, which is a very valuable property of these chemicals. Some are selective. They might kill grasses, they might kill broadleaf weeds, and if you have a vital plant that you want to preserve and protect, going in with a mow or a spade versus a selective herbicide, that's a choice you might have to consider a little bit more often if you want to go that way. Efficacy varies enormously by product. Just because it's got a label on it for killing invasive weeds, it doesn't mean it's much good. You've got to try them, you've got to trust people that are local here, that understand how to use these chemicals in the circumstances in which they're needed. Many different approaches. You can apply them to foliage, you can apply basal applications just to the root zone. You can just take a little paintbrush with some herbicide on and dab it on the cut stump of a plant that you removed, and then you can kill the roots. Lots of different approaches, rather selective, tiny amounts of chemical used. Is that so bad? It may, I can understand them not being used. That's a public choice. But it's also something to consider that many of the communities up and down the West Coast have actually commissioned reviews of the risks that herbicides have posed. They've discussed that as a community, what's acceptable, what isn't acceptable. They've come up with compounds and uses they do find are acceptable, and then those groups are only used in exceptional circumstances when they're needed. That's an option that's open to you. If you don't want to go that way, that's also an option that's open to you. I just need to mention that because it's certainly practiced in many places on the West Coast. Cost examples. Here's one, a 10-year cost for hand pulling in the top row, where for broom, about 350 hours were needed per acre over 10 years. The cost of $25 an hour, that's $8,700. Propane flaming, about 75 hours over 10 years, $1,875. But if someone goes in with a knapsack sprayer with a herbicide and does little spot treatments, that's 4 hours and $300 at a higher rate of labour cost. Again, needs to be considered. It's not the only dimension, but if you do that in a place that's out of, doesn't have access to streams and is away from any residential areas or sensitive residential sites, then you can focus your resources on the places where you really do want to be incredibly careful and protect sensitive subpopulations. So you've got options, you've got priorities. It's not one size fits all. I'm not advocating any approach here, I must remind you. I'm just saying that each approach has strengths and weaknesses. So here's something I learned from a site that your mayor was involved in, actually, in his distinguished past. He's run out of the room, has he? I don't know if I'm still there. So the kind of do-nothing approach was still costly because you really had to do something to prevent some of the damage and the plants growing out over the road and other things. But you can have, so that's a kind of 1x cost. Let's call it $100, it could be $1 million. In this case, actually, it was millions of dollars in this particular area. You can suppress plants without any habitat restoration. That really means kind of herbicides and kind of scorched earth approaches, which have been common historically, and we're resistant to those now. But they don't improve your biological resources, they don't help with habitat restoration, but they perhaps for recreational purposes, they open up the land again for access. And those costs are about the same as doing nothing in many ways, because you still have to do something in some regards. If you manage with restoration and no herbicides, the multiplier there is about 8 times to get those biological resources protected that we value, the habitat restoration and recreational opportunities. Managing with the help of herbicides is less expensive. Who knows if it's better or worse? These are approaches that were believed to achieve a pretty similar outcome. And this group I'm talking about chose this line here. They decided that this ATEX approach would be pretty good because they demonstrated after 10 years the costs per acre would be the same because they'd have got these invasive plants down to something that was tolerable and doable. So that's, again, a process that could be gone through with your committee, and we could offer some facilitation and support for that, dependent on our other priorities. What do we do? Just a couple of pictures at the end, so you don't think, oh, that was that guy that just droned on with all those words all that time, okay? So farmers in Oregon have a challenge, don't they? They've got all these invasive plants going along their hedgerows, and they're taking out the plants that provide pollination and services and nectar and pollen for natural enemies, and it's not doing their crops a lot of good. So there's a huge amount of interest in Oregon. Probably hundreds of miles of farm edges are being planted with the type of plants that probably will encourage Josh and myself and Lisa and others will encourage you to plant in the places where you're removing these invasive species. So we have a thing called a farming club, a beetle bank club, where we select places on farms. And I can't, in this particular farm here, is that arrow visible on your screen? Yes. Okay, that little strip there had invasive grasses in it, and we removed those and we put in native grasses that act as overwintering habitat for predatory beetles. How great. And that's a group of farmers working together. They learn how to use the practice, then they all go to their own farms and do that. And this is a thing called a beetle bank, and this is what it looks like in the summer. It's native grasses that are meant to look dry in the summer, okay? You don't need to irrigate them, but they displaced a very weedy area on this organic farm. I just wanted to make the point, though, that this farmer, in order to establish those native plants up the middle of her field in this case, used cover cropping and mulching in the year before she put in the native plants. And then, after she had planted the native plants, she used a flaming device to kill the invasive weeds that got there, that were establishing themselves before the native plants established. So she had a year of site preparation, then she also did intensive management in the year of plant establishment, and she had fantastic success. So site preparation is an absolutely critical thing, and the farmers can tell us a lot about that. And we do crazy things like mapping people's farms for all the different habitats they have. And this is part of a 900-acre farm we're working on near Mount Angel at the moment. You drive past, you think, oh, chemical disaster, all of that. You look out and you think, oh, up I-5, I'm not going to get out of the car and sniff the air around here. Actually, we've got 900 acres of extraordinarily productive and amazingly sustainable agriculture. And this lady in the Goshen family, Gail, is planting a whole range of habitats all around these yellow areas of her fields with the type of plants we're talking about for your area to encourage bees and beneficial insects. So there's amazing things happening in Oregon agriculture. I've got some lists of plants to show you there. There's technical resources to look at. I'm sorry I'm eating into your time, but I'm nearly done. And this is a thing called Plants for Pollinators in Oregon. It's available on the homepage of our website. It's easy to find. It's from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And you can, basically, it's wonderful tables of plants. It gives you the name of the plant on the left. Then it tells you which growth zones that they grow in. And then the yellow and blue colours tell you whether they encourage pollinators or other types of beneficial insect. Then it tells you what the bloom period is, what the flower colour might be, what the height of maturity is, what its light needs are, its drought tolerance, all of those things. So here's the thing. We went far, I'm just finishing now, Wally. You don't need to chase me on. We went to a site today where there's reed canary grass, and the local population wants to keep the view of the lovely river or estuary they've got flowing up near their houses. You know, Wally's actually one of the residents. I have to be careful what I say. So there's plants here that might grow to a height that actually aren't going to interfere with his view. which also might grow well in that type of habitat, that might stabilise the bank, that might survive when it gets flooded, might cope with the salt. You know, there's all of those things one needs to do, but you can imagine restoring that area to have vegetation along it that actually creates a riparian zone that's viable and not susceptible to native species. So that goal is achievable. We know what the plants are, but just preparing a community to work in the long term to get this achieved, that's the magic of doing this properly. So anyway, I hope I've fascinated you as the work crew here today. I know you're going to be excited to work with this amazing team that's been set up. It's a privilege to talk with you, and that was my kind of introductory thought to share. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And just rest assured, after we've heard from our 4 panelists, we will have time for questions and answers. So, answers, relatively speaking, as best as we can do at this point.